Welcome back. This session, I'd like to talk about Uber. When Lyft went public on March 29th of 2019, we knew it was only a matter of time before Uber went public and the other ride-sharing companies followed. But I was surprised at how quickly Uber entered the fray with its prospectus filing on April 12th of 2019. I'm going to base my valuation on that prospectus, but I have to tell you up front that I've never seen a company that has been a private company get as much public attention as Uber has over the last 5 years. In good ways and bad ways, this company's been in the news. So it is interesting that finally this most private of all companies is going to go public. I've also valued Uber multiple times along the way, but I've always valued it with tidbits of information. Finally, it's good to actually get the financials of the company so I can take a meatier look at the numbers. So first thing I did was look at the prospectus, and the prospectus is weighty. It's 285 pages of words and then 50 to 60 pages of financials and more numbers. It is dense and it's filled with information that I don't think is particularly useful for investors. In fact, let me take back that word information. It's filled with data. And I don't quite blame Uber for this. This is the result of information disclosure gone crazy, where disclosure requirements are actually having the perverse impact of creating so much information overload that the disclosures are losing their value. For instance, there was a sentence in the prospectus that drove some value investors crazy, where Uber said that they might never make money. I'll be quite honest, I'm going to cut Uber some slack here. Because if you let the lawyers write the risk section of prospectus, this is exactly what they will say. In fact, I own a house 2 blocks from the beach, and if I ever had to sell a house and write the risk section like the lawyers in a prospectus would, I'd have to tell you that with global warming, my house will be underwater probably sooner rather than later. And since I live in California, it's only a matter of time before an earthquake or a fire takes out my house. So I would not be too harsh on Uber for that statement. But let's take a deeper look at what Uber said in that statement. The first thing to note is how Uber defines its market. It's interesting because Lyft, when in its prospectus, tried as hard as it could to never use the word car service to describe what it did. Instead, it called itself a transportation services company. Uber calls itself a personal mobility business. And this business, in many ways, is even bigger than the transportation services business. In fact, Uber has a picture in the prospectus that tells the world how big they think this business is. It's $2 trillion because it includes public transit, public car service, private transportation, pretty much everything. In fact, I'm surprised that Uber did not include the calories that people spend walking from point A to point B as part of this business. But in a sense, again, I can understand why Uber is doing what it is and what Lyft was doing as well, which is you want to define the business as big as possible because you want a big pricing and a big value to go with it. I'd be a little cynical about the size of this business though, because I'm pretty sure that 2 trillion is a vast overreach. So let's start with the good news in Uber. It's a growth story. And the growth story is particularly in the numbers that reflect how quickly they've grown their car service business. Its gross billings are up 160%. Its net revenues are up almost 211%. Its riders have almost doubled, have little more than doubled over the last 2 years. And its trips have gone from 1.8 billion to 5.2 billion. The growth has been phenomenal. That is the good side of the story. The bad side of the story is while it's been growing, Uber's been losing money, and it's been losing tons. In fact, it's in the prospectus, Uber estimate what it's called its adjusted EBITDA. It's rosier look at how much it's losing. And even in the rosier look, it lost $1.85 billion in 2018. Now, that adjusted EBITDA is not the measure that I think truly measures the earnings of the company. And so I adjusted their EBITDA further by first bringing back the DA because I wanted an operating loss, not an EBITDA. And I also reversed something that Uber did to get to their adjusted EBITDA, which is take out the effect of stock-based compensation. Stock-based compensation is like any other compensation as far as I'm concerned. So my operating loss, adjusted for Uber's adjustments, is about $2.4 billion. Now, if you look at the good news on this table, the only good news is there are some economies of scale that seem to be kicking in. The losses are becoming a smaller percentage of revenues, and that is perhaps good news for Uber. Let's look at the rider numbers. If you look at the gross billings per rider, Uber's been able to get riders to use more of their services over time. Their gross billings have gone up by 28%. If there's any bad news in this table, the only bad news is the per trip gross billings are decreasing, which means that riders are using Uber for shorter trips. And that might not be bad news. That might be a change of behavior on the part of riders that might benefit Uber in the long term. The net revenues are increasing, and the net revenues per trip have kind of leveled off. The trips per rider, as you can see, riders on Uber are taking more trips on the service, all pretty much good news from a rider perspective. So now let's look at Uber's expenses. Now, Uber's expenses are broken down in the financial statements, but I took the expenses and put them into three buckets. The first is I took selling expenses and assumed that those selling expenses were directly related to the number of new users added on. That might be a stretch, but I divided the number of users added by the selling expenses by the number of users added to get the cost of acquiring new users each year. And you can see that the cost of acquiring users has been climbing over time. Second, I took their cost of revenues and operation support and treat them as operating expenses for existing riders. This is going to allow me to estimate how much they're making from their existing riders. And finally, I took those expenses that I did not think were related to riders, things like G&A, R&D, and depreciation amortization, and called them my corporate expenses. These corporate expenses are, in a sense, those fixed costs that the company has to cover from its business. The good news in the corporate expenses is they've been decreasing over time. And operating expenses on existing rides have also had the right trends. They've been moving down. Now let's look at Uber overall as a company. It is a more complex company than Lyft, partly because its ambitions have always been greater. It's never thought of itself as just being in the ride-sharing business, and it's wanted to always go into other logistical businesses. And if you look at the last 2 years, they've been pretty successful, at least in one area, which is in the delivery business. Uber Eats has become an increasing part of Uber's overall revenues. It's risen from 2% to 13%. In fact, it's the only one of the logistical tries that Uber has made that seems to have had some sticking power, because everything else is a very small slice, all of the other Uber bets. So perhaps there's something in the Uber Eats business that feeds off their ride-sharing business. There's one thing, though, about the Uber Eats business that is a little concerning. In another part of the prospectus, Uber breaks down its adjusted net revenue in each of the two businesses, ride-sharing and Uber Eats. And if you compare them, it's quite clear that Uber keeps a much smaller slice of its gross billings in the Uber Eats business than it does in the ride-sharing business. Something to think about if that is where their future lies. Now, in terms of the geographical reach, Uber, unlike Lyft, has wanted to be all things all over the world. And maybe the realities had a way of putting a crimp on its geographical ambitions, because over the last 3 years, Uber's extracted itself from big parts of Asia. It stopped its operations in China and settled for a 20% share of Didi. It suspended its operations in Southeast Asia and settled for a 23% share of Grab. It gave up on Russia and settled for a piece of Yandex Taxi. And it might very well give up on India and take a piece of Ola. But if you look at the breakdown, the part of the world where Uber seems to be growing fast is actually Latin America. Unfortunately, Uber does not give a breakdown of the profitability by region. But my guess is that the US remains the most lucrative ride-sharing market in the world. And I base this on the fact that when they've got out of Asia, the amounts they've had to write off, reflecting how much money they were losing there, have been immense, in the billions of dollars, not hundreds of millions. So let's do an Uber top-down valuation, just like I did for Lyft. If you remember for Lyft, I started with the transportation services market for North America as being that their total accessible market, and I built down from there. Uber's a little messier because Uber's ambitions, as I said, are much greater. They're not just ride sharing, they're in other aspects of logistics. They're not just in the US, they're all over the world. So I am going to approach my top-down valuation with a little more reluctance than I did my Lyft valuation because I feel my total accessible market estimate is a much softer number. Notwithstanding that much softer number, here's what my valuation looks like. And I have to tell you up front that the story I'm telling for Uber is a pretty optimistic story. I see Uber's revenues increasing from about 10 billion right now to 66 billion by the end of year 10. I see their losses turning to profits, that they will find a pathway to profitability, which they haven't yet, and move their margins towards 15%. They will have to reinvest some money along the way, perhaps in autonomous vehicles, perhaps in some other competitive barriers to entry, but that reinvestment does put a drain on their cash. Their cash flows, though, start negative. There's cash burn for the first few years, but then it turns a corner and the cash flows build up. I take the present value of those cash flows using a 9.97% cost of capital, which is the 75th percentile of cost of capital for US companies. I discount the cash flows back. I get a value for the operating assets of just over 46.7 billion. I do think there is still a chance that Uber might not make it. A small chance because it's such a big company with good access to capital, but it's still a money-losing, cash-burning company, so I put that likelihood of failure at 5%. The value that I get for the operating assets is about 44.4 billion. I'm not quite done. To that, I add the cash balance of 6.5 billion. I add the IPO proceeds, which are expected to be about 9 billion. I also, on top of that, add the cross holdings of 8.7 billion. I subtract out my debt of 6.5 billion. The value that I get for the equity is about $62.7 billion. Now, to get to the number of shares, things are a little hazy, and you'll notice a lot of blank spots in the prospectus where the share count will come in more explicitly in a couple of weeks. But here's what we know. After the IPO, there will be 903.6 million shares outstanding at least. That's a convertible preferred converted into common. And on top of that, I've got to have shares for options and restricted stock units and any new shares that will be issued to raise the 9 to 10 billion that they hope to raise in the IPO. All in all, I expect Uber to have about 1,175 million shares outstanding after the IPO. And you divide the value of equity by that 1,175 million share count, you get a value per share of about $53 to $54. That is my top-down estimate. But let's keep going. As I said, my top-down estimate is heavily dependent on my getting the total accessible market right, and I'm not quite comfortable with my estimate there. So I'm going to use an approach that I developed a couple of years ago to value Uber by valuing its riders and building up. I'm going to call this my bottom-up approach. And in this approach, here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to start by valuing an existing rider. By doing what? By estimating the expected cash flows from a rider based on the lifetime that I see them having with Uber. I'm going to come up with a value per existing rider. You multiply that by the number of existing riders, you get a total value for existing riders. To that, I'm going to add the value of expected new riders. To get this first, I'm going to get a value for each new rider by subtracting out the cost of acquiring a new rider from a value of an existing rider. Then I'm going to estimate how many new riders Uber will get over the next decade and come up with the value of the new riders. Value of existing riders plus value of new riders, but I'm not quite done. There will be costs that are not rider related that will create a drag on this value. I'm going to estimate the present value of those costs and subtract them from the total value of the riders. Ready? Let's try. To value the existing users, I give each user a 15-year life. I assume that in my story at least, that existing users will not just stay on and be loyal. Their renewal rates are going to be close to 95%, but that they will buy more of Uber's services. The growth rate is not going to be as high as it was over the last couple of years, but I think that slowing should be expected. I'm still expecting a healthy increase of 12% in Uber services that existing riders will buy every year. So that growth rate will increase the services they buy. Now the expenses, I'm going to assume that 95 that these expenses are primarily variable. So there'll be some fixed expenses, so there'll be some economies of scale, but over time the operating margins will improve slightly on existing users. With those assumptions in place, the value that I get per existing user is $487, and you multiply that by 91 million users, you got just in excess of 44 billion coming from existing users. Now, to value new users, I subtract out my estimate of the cost of acquisition based on what I saw last year. And that estimate of $114 reduces my value for a new user to about $373. I then estimate the number of new users by assuming that Uber is going to continue to add riders. Not again at the rate that they've been able to do over the last few years because they're now scaled up. But I do estimate a healthy growth rate of 12% in riders for the next 5 years and 6% thereafter, which effectively brings the total user count to almost 215 million users by the time I get to year 10. The value that I get for these new users is about $60 billion, and that's on top of my existing user base. Finally, I estimate the cost of the corporate drag by taking the present value of my costs over time. I do assume that my costs will grow at a fairly healthy rate, 7.5%, because embedded in these costs are any investments that Uber will have to make in autonomous vehicles. You add those numbers up, you get a value for the operating assets using a user-based approach. Then you add the cash, you add the $9 billion in IPO proceeds, you add the cross holdings, you subtract our debt. You get a value for the equity of about $58.6 billion. A little lower than what I got with my top-down approach, but not by much. The value that I get using this approach is about $51. So in effect, my value for Uber is around $60 billion using both approaches. Now, one of the nice things about doing the user-based approach is I can now ask what-if questions. And those what-if questions are going to revolve around two key variables. One is how much you can get existing users to grow to increase their usage of Uber. And I'm going to capture that with a compounded annual growth rate in net revenues per user, ranging from 3 to 18%. And the cost of acquiring a new user, right now about 113, I vary from 80 to 160. Now, when you look at this table, the numbers obviously vary a lot. They can range from minus 8.4 billion if the growth rate in revenues per user is only 3% and it costs $160 to get a new user, to almost 140 billion if everything clicks. You reduce your cost per user to $80 and you grow your revenues by 18%. Now, if you look at this table and you're a trader or somebody who's deeply suspicious of intrinsic value, you're going to say, I told you so. This is why you can't trust those intrinsic value guys, because they can make their models give you any number they want. And if that's what you believe, I'm not going to talk you out of it because your suspicions are well founded. I'm an investor though, and when I look at this table, here's what I see. I see a company on a knife's edge where if good things happen, the value could be high, but if things don't click, you could very quickly see the value implode. But perhaps more importantly, what I see in this table is I have a story and a value for Uber. And if somebody else has a much bigger story and a much bigger value, who am I to tell them that they're wrong? And if you tell me you think Uber is worth nothing, well, you have your story and you're entitled to your view as well. None of us has a monopoly on the truth here, but it does suggest that different stories can lead us to very different destinations. Now, if there are pathways for Uber on this table, here's what I see. I see Uber as a company poised on a knife's edge. If it continues to just go for count, add to its riders, pushing up the cost of acquiring riders and not fixing the cost structure and not getting it, I think it is in danger of imploding. If it can get riders to significantly increase their revenues over time and perhaps keep its cost of acquiring new users under control, I think it could be worth 100 billion or more. And the second thing that comes out of this table is the payoff, as I see it for Uber, is much greater if it can get existing users to use more of its service. That would be greater than going for new riders. So it's a choice that Uber has between going for new riders or trying to get existing riders to buy more of its services. I would go with the latter every single time. So I am glad that Dara is talking about finding a pathway to profitability, and I hope he means it. But his actions will speak louder than his words. I think the market will be watching to see if what he does is consistent with the company seeking to be profitable. I must confess I'm not particularly excited about the acquisition of Careem. It seems to be that buying a Middle Eastern ride-sharing company can add to your riders, but it doesn't put you on the pathway to profitability. But I could be wrong. Now, having said all of this about the value of Uber, I have to also reflect a reality, which is when Uber goes public, it is going to be priced, and it's going to be priced against Lyft. Priced as opposed to what? As opposed to value. So to get a sense of how much Uber's pricing is going to be relative to Lyft, let's compare the two companies. On almost every dimension, you will find that Uber is a much bigger company than Lyft. Its gross billings are about 5 times higher. Its net revenues are significantly higher, also about 5 times higher. It's losing a lot more money. It's larger in that sense as well. And on riders, drivers, cities, rides, it is a much bigger company than Lyft. So you can start off with a safe assumption that its pricing is going to be much greater than Lyft. But how much greater? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take Lyft's pricing, which we know because it's in the market, and compute multiples of different metrics and see what those metrics would yield as a pricing for Uber. So let's start with gross billings. If you look at the Lyft enterprise value, Lyft's market cap is about 17 billion, but its enterprise value is lower because it has a large cash balance. Lyft trades for about 1.8 times revenues of gross billings. If you apply that 1.8 times gross billing to Uber's gross billings, you come up with 90.3 billion as Uber's enterprise value. You add cash, including the proceeds, you add the cross holdings, and you subtract out the debt. The value that you get for Uber's equity is 108 billion, which translates into a value per share of about $92. You can try this with enterprise value to revenue, where you get a lower value, enterprise value to rider, where you get about 88 billion for the equity and $75 per share. For drivers, where you get about 69 billion, about $59 per share. You can even do it by ride, in which case you get the largest of the numbers, 124 billion for the equity and about $106 per share. But you can see that with different metrics, you can get different numbers. So if you're running away from discounted cash flow valuation because you think pricing is going to give you a more precise answer, you got to let go of that notion. Pricing comes with its own subjective judgments that can lead you to very different places. So at this stage, the ball's in your court. I'm sure that you will look at my valuations and you will disagree with my assumptions. In fact, many of you know a lot more about Uber than I do. And I welcome you to take my spreadsheet and make it your own. Change the numbers that you don't agree with and come up with your estimate of value for Uber. Because this is a company that is going to be part of the market landscape for a few years from now. And I'm sure that this is not going to be the last time I'm valuing Uber. But the next time I come back to Uber, there's going to be a market price out there. And that's going to provide an immediate feedback on how different my value is from the price. So glad you joined me, and thank you for listening.